Anne Boleyn's execution shattered the Catholic hold on England. Her memory was meant to vanish, erased from royal ledgers and sealed vaults. But now, new genetic analysis claims to unearth secrets from remains linked to the Queen herself. Hidden medical conditions, chemical traces of royal embalming. If these findings are true, everything the Church suppressed about Anne's death and her influence could finally surface. What did they erase, and why? Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII in 1533 did more than crown a new queen. It forced England onto a path no other European monarchy dared to tread. By 1534, Parliament had passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry, not the Pope, as head of the Church of England. This was not just a personal matter. The king's break from Rome, grounded in his union with Anne, upended centuries of religious authority. The move set off a chain reaction. Monasteries dissolved, church lands seized, and a new order imposed on every parish in the realm. Contemporary voices captured the unease. Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, wrote from London of a court transformed by Anne's presence and Henry's ambition. Chapuis described how her influence stirred the king's conscience and fueled a climate where old loyalties were suspect and new alliances were dangerous. Anne's support for reformers, her encouragement of English translations of scripture, and her proximity to the king made her both a symbol and an architect of the schism. Yet as quickly as Anne rose, the machinery of state moved to erase her. After her arrest and execution in May 1536, the official record fell silent. Royal household ledgers, meticulous in their tracking of every expense, suddenly show blank pages and missing entries for the days surrounding Anne's downfall. In the Privy Purse accounts, payments for the Queen's chamber stop abruptly before her imprisonment, leaving a gap where records should have marked her last days. The National Archives preserve household books for May 1536, with entire folios empty or erased, a rare break in the otherwise unbroken chain of court documentation. Chapuis, observing the aftermath, reported to his master that there had been a wonderful silence as regards the Queen's death. No sermon, no public speech, and as far as he could learn, no record intended to be made of the fact. His dispatches, preserved in the Vienna archives, stand as some of the only surviving testimony to the policy of silence imposed from above. Anne's memory was not simply neglected, it was actively scrubbed from the ledgers and chronicles that defined royal legitimacy. The stakes were enormous. To admit her influence was to admit the fragility of the new church, and so the written evidence was made to vanish, page by page, line by line. In 1876, the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, inside the Tower of London, became a construction site. Victorian workers, under orders to refurbish the aging chapel, tore up the chancel floor and uncovered a tangled layer of human remains. Among those overseeing the work stood Dr. Frederick Muat, a surgeon and government inspector, and Doyne C. Bell, secretary to the Office of Works. Both men were tasked with the impossible: to identify, catalogue, and respectfully reinter the bones of those executed centuries before, including queens whose burials had been hurried and unmarked. The process was anything but precise. Muat and Bell relied on burial positions, coffin fragments, and scattered historical notes to match bones to names. Their reports describe a jumble of skeletons, some partial, some mixed, most lacking any clear marker. Bell's catalogue, published in 1877, lists the supposed resting places of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Rochford, but even he admitted the uncertainty. Some remains were reburied in new lead coffins, others gathered into communal graves. The documentation was patchy. A few fragments, likely separated for study or display, were never clearly labelled or logged. The records from this period are incomplete. Letters between Muat, Bell, and the Office of Works mention removals and reburials, but do not always specify which remains went where. Some bone fragments attributed to Anne Boleyn appear in later inventories, but their chain of custody from the exhumation to modern times is broken by missing paperwork and ambiguous catalogue entries. Historic royal palaces, the present custodians, acknowledge that no continuous, unaltered line of documentation exists for these relics. The gap in provenance is not a minor oversight. It is a chasm that complicates every subsequent scientific claim. Modern researchers seeking to authenticate any fragment believed to be Anne's must reckon with this Victorian breach. The absence of detailed, reliable logs from the 1876 to 1877 refurbishment means that any sample, no matter how carefully analysed today, carries the shadow of uncertainty. The story of Anne Boleyn's remains is not just about what science can reveal, but about what history failed to preserve. In the sterile quiet of a modern genetics lab, a technician lifts a fragment of bone from a sealed envelope. The label reads only Fragment A. Its paper trail, though incomplete, traces back to a Victorian catalogue from St. Peter ad Vincula, dated 1876. The fragment is weighed, photographed, and then drilled for powder. This is the start of an analysis that will yield numbers, not legends. A short sequence of mitochondrial DNA is the first result. The reads cluster around haplogroup H1, a common maternal lineage in Europe. But the assignment is made with 22-fold coverage, enough to rule out most contamination, but not enough for certainty. The lab software Haplogrep generates a list of single nucleotide polymorphisms, C623T, TX301C, and others. Each variant is tabulated, cross-referenced with the Cambridge reference sequence, and checked against a database of 16th century remains. The technician notes the low frequency of ambiguous bases, but flags the entire sample for possible modern DNA intrusion. Every step is logged. The haplogroup data is suggestive, not conclusive. Nuclear DNA proves more elusive. At best, a handful of reads align to genes like CYP2C19 and COMT, both flagged in medical databases for their links to metabolism and hormone processing. Coverage here drops to between 2 and 8 reads per site, far below the threshold for confident trait prediction. Nonetheless, the report notes 2 alleles associated in modern studies with subtle endocrine variation. The asterisk in the margin is a warning. These associations are speculative, and the sample is too degraded for clinical inference. Chemical analysis proceeds in parallel. Gas chromatography reveals peaks for abietic acid, eugenol, and cinnamaldehyde, compounds matching Tudor embalming recipes. The ratios of beeswax esters and pine resin diterpenoids suggest a mixture consistent with royal mortuary practice, but the same markers could result from later conservation. Trace mercury is detected by ICP-MS, raising the possibility of historical disinfection, but also of post-burial contamination. The chemistry is suggestive, not definitive. Accelerator mass spectrometry delivers a radiocarbon date. Calibrated probability places the fragment between 1480 and 1560 AD. The isotope signature, enriched in nitrogen, matches a high-status Tudor diet, but the range is wide and cannot confirm a name. The numbers are precise, but the chain of evidence remains incomplete. This date anchors the object in time, but it does not close the case. Each metric, haplogroup, single nucleotide polymorphism, compound, date stands as a data point, not a verdict. The evidence is technical, transparent, and open to scrutiny, but the past resists easy answers. Investigators must weigh the science against gaps in provenance and accept uncertainty where certainty cannot be claimed. The evidence invites questions. It does not demand finality. Authenticating centuries-old remains demands more than laboratory precision. Every step from sampling to sequencing is shadowed by the risk of contamination. Even with strict protocols, foreign DNA can infiltrate a sample, and current standards allow for a contamination rate of up to 6% before results are considered unreliable. In the case of the so-called Anne Boleyn fragment, contamination estimates fall between 2 and 6%, a range that leaves room for doubt. Ancient DNA specialists point to the Richard III project as a benchmark, where every sequence and chemical result was published, raw data made available for independent scrutiny, and permissions from all custodial bodies were fully documented. No such transparency has yet accompanied claims about Anne Boleyn's remains. Replicability is the foundation of scientific confidence. For any genetic or chemical finding to stand, independent laboratories must be able to reproduce the results using new samples, ideally under the supervision of the custodians, historic royal palaces, and the Church of England. Without their explicit documented consent, any destructive testing on royal remains is not only ethically fraught but also legally questionable. Current guidelines require signed permissions from both the site custodians and descendant representatives, as well as detailed logs of every transfer, analysis, and storage event. These protocols are designed to prevent the very ambiguities that now cloud the Victorian-era fragments. Damage profiles offer another safeguard. Authentic ancient DNA displays distinctive patterns, short fragment lengths, and a high rate of cytosine to thymine substitutions at the ends. Software such as map damage and Schmutzi is used to visualize these patterns and to estimate contamination. Yet unless the raw output files, fragment length distributions, substitution plots, contamination estimates are released, outside experts cannot verify the authenticity of the findings. Calls for open data echo across the field, but so far, no laboratory has published the full analytical record for any remains attributed to Anne Boleyn. Every claim remains provisional until it is replicated, audited, and supported by an unbroken chain of permissions and data. The absence of these safeguards does not prove fraud, but it does demand caution. In historical genetics, the standard is not simply what can be shown, but what can be shown to others, and proven again and again by independent hands. Centuries later, pieces of Anne Boleyn's story remain locked away, some in stone, some in silence. As advances in science confront the limits of secrecy, what is buried often shapes what we believe. The search for truth outlives those who try to erase it.